It was supposed to be just another afternoon. The kind where a mother steps out for a little while, leaving her child in the hands of someone she trusts. The kind of day where nothing should go wrong. But at exactly 3 p.m., a man was seen frantically running through a quiet neighborhood, clutching a lifeless toddler in his arms. His voice was shaking as he banged on a neighbor's door, pleading for help. The small child in his grip, limp, unresponsive. Her tiny frame was marked with bruises, her skin cold to the touch. The neighbor's heart must have stopped for a moment, confusion clouding their mind before panic set in. They scrambled to call 911 as the man, breathless and desperate, attempted CPR. To an outsider, it looked like the frantic efforts of a caregiver in distress. A last-ditch attempt to save an innocent life. But when the paramedics arrived, they saw something that changed everything. This wasn't just a tragic accident. It was something far more horrifying. The bruises weren't the kind a child gets from falling while playing. The wounds on her body told a different story. A story of suffering. A story of betrayal. A story no child should ever have to live. And the man standing over her, the one screaming for help, wasn't just some concerned guardian. He was her killer. This is the tragic case of Koralynn Fister, a 2-year-old whose life was cut short in the most horrific way imaginable. Stay with us as we unravel the chilling details of this heartbreaking story. But before we begin, if you're passionate about true crime and want to hear the stories that need to be told, subscribe to True Crime Watch HD. Your support helps us shine a light on cases like this, cases that should never be forgotten. Now, let's begin. Koralynn Fister was a child full of life, her laughter filling the small mobile home where she lived with her mother, Becky Hoypel, and her older sister. At just 2 years old, she was in the stage where every moment was a discovery, every corner of the house an adventure, every new word a victory. But behind closed doors, the world she knew was changing. Becky Hoypel, at 30 years old, was a mother doing her best, but life had never been easy for her. She had developmental challenges that made daily life overwhelming at times. She was described by family and friends as a kind person, always caring for those around her, including her elderly grandmother and her mentally handicapped sister. She had already faced struggles in her relationships. The father of her children had been absent, disinterested. He told her, bluntly, that he didn't do the baby thing. And so, Becky carried the weight of motherhood largely on her own. That's when she met James Reeder. He was charming, supportive, helpful. Everything Becky had been missing. Within weeks of meeting online, he moved into her home. He cooked, he cleaned, and most importantly, he paid attention to her children. At first, it seemed like a dream come true. But dreams can be deceiving. Because James Reeder was not the man he pretended to be. He had a past, one filled with violence, manipulation, and abuse. A past that should have raised every alarm. A past that, tragically, Becky either didn't know about or chose to ignore. And it wouldn't be long before the consequences of that decision would become painfully clear. It started with small things. Little moments that should have made Becky pause. The way Koralynn started flinching when Reeder reached for her. The unexplained bruises on her tiny arms and legs. The small whimpers when she was picked up. The way she no longer smiled quite as much. One day, Becky's grandmother noticed something that made her stomach turn, a dark, unusual bruise near Koralynn's private area. She mentioned it to Becky, her voice filled with worry. But Reeder had an explanation for everything. "It's nothing," he said. "She fell. She hit her head against the wall. The dog jumped on her." He was always ready with an excuse, always dismissive, always making Becky feel like she was overreacting. And over time, Becky started to believe him. The warnings from friends, the concerned looks from family. It was easier to trust Reeder's words than to face the horrifying alternative. After all, she was overwhelmed. He was helping, right? So she let him take more control. more responsibility. And that mistake would cost her daughter everything. May 24, 2012. Becky left the house around noon. A short trip with her older daughter, her sister, and her grandmother. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just a few hours away. Koralynn stayed behind. Left in the care of James Reeder. By the time Becky returned, her baby girl was gone. According to Reeder, he had been giving Koralynn a bath when he stepped out of the room for just a moment to grab a towel. And in that moment, he claimed, she drowned. A tragic accident. That's what he wanted everyone to believe. But when paramedics arrived, the truth was clear. Koralynn's body was cold. Too cold. Her tiny frame covered in cuts, bruises, and injuries too horrifying to describe. She had been gone long before Reeder ever called for help. And the signs of abuse, they weren't new. They had been there for weeks. As investigators pieced together the details of Koralynn's final moments, one question lingered. Could this have been prevented? How many times do we ignore the warning signs, assuming everything is fine when, in reality, danger is lurking just beneath the surface? Do you think Becky should have known? Was she a victim herself, manipulated and controlled? Or did she bear responsibility for failing to protect her child? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. When paramedics arrived that afternoon, they were met with a sight that stopped them cold. The toddler's lifeless body was covered in injuries that had no place on a child so young. Bruises, burns, deep wounds. Some fresh, some old. Some had begun to heal. Koralynn hadn't just died. She had suffered. And yet, standing there, pretending to be the desperate caregiver, was James Reeder, the man who claimed he had done everything he could to save her. At first, he played the part well. He told authorities that it had been an accident, that he had left the bathroom for just a moment, only to return and find her submerged in the water. He had panicked, rushed her to the neighbors for help, and now he was devastated. But his story didn't hold up for long, because the facts told a different story. Forensic investigators don't rely on emotions, explanations, or performances. They rely on evidence. And in this case, the evidence was undeniable. The medical examiner's report revealed that Koralynn's body showed extensive signs of prolonged abuse. Her cause of death wasn't just drowning, it was blunt force head trauma. And even worse, she hadn't died in that bathtub. She had been dead long before James Reeder ever screamed for help. Her body temperature was dangerously low by the time first responders arrived, indicating that she had been deceased for hours before Reeder even pretended to care. And then there were the injuries. The horrifying extent of what had been done to this little girl went far beyond a single moment of violence. This was systematic. This was torture. Bruises covering her head, torso, and legs. Lacerations in areas that should never have been harmed. 2 large patches of skin missing from her small body. This wasn't a drowning. This wasn't a mistake. This was the brutal reality of what Koralynn had endured in her final weeks. And James Reeder wasn't just a grieving guardian. He was a predator. When detectives turned their attention to Becky Heupel, they were left with another disturbing question. How had this gone unnoticed? Becky wasn't just Koralynn's mother. She was the person responsible for her safety, the one who should have been her shield. And yet, the evidence showed that Koralynn's abuse had been happening for weeks. Family members had noticed injuries. A bruise in an intimate area. Cuts and marks that didn't make sense for a 2-year-old child. And Becky had seen them too. She had even asked James about them. But every time, he had an excuse. She fell. She ran into something. The dog knocked her down. And Becky, despite the warnings from her grandmother and friends, chose to believe him. But why? This is where the case becomes more complex. Becky had a documented history of cognitive disabilities. She functioned at an 8th grade level, struggled with chronic pain, and had been dependent on others to help her navigate life. James Reeder knew this. And like any experienced manipulator, he exploited her weaknesses. He didn't just take over as the man in the house. He took over her decisions, her thoughts, her trust. By the time the abuse escalated, Becky had been conditioned to doubt herself, ignore her instincts, and rely on him completely. But was that an excuse? Did her limitations absolve her of responsibility? Or had she simply been too passive when her child needed her most? It was a question that would haunt investigators, prosecutors, and the public alike. As detectives dug deeper into James Reeder's past, the picture became even more chilling. Because Koralynn wasn't his first victim. He had 2 biological children of his own, but he had no contact with them. Their mothers had long since cut him out of their lives. When police reached out to Reeder's ex-girlfriends, the stories they told were eerily similar. Controlling, violent, manipulative. One woman recalled how he would demand to see her phone, accuse her of cheating, and isolate her from friends and family. Another described a terrifying night 4 days after giving birth, when Reeder pinned her down, choked her, and sexually assaulted her, tearing the sutures from childbirth. He was a serial abuser. A man who preyed on vulnerable women, worming his way into their lives, establishing dominance, and then escalating into full control. And with Becky, he had found the perfect target. A woman desperate for love. A woman with limited ability to stand up for herself. A woman who had 2 small children. Easy prey. When James Reeder was brought in for questioning, detectives didn't let him speak first. They started with the autopsy report, the timeline, the injuries, the forensic evidence that shattered his entire version of events. They watched as the nervous energy drained from his face. He still tried to deny it at first. She fell. She must have hit her head. I didn't do anything. But the evidence was overwhelming. And slowly, his demeanor shifted. No more tears. No more frantic explanations. Just silence. Because he knew. He wasn't getting out of this. The case against James Reeder was one of the strongest prosecutors had ever seen. The charges were severe. Homicide by abuse. 2 counts of child rape. 2nd-degree assault. Possession of methamphetamine. If convicted on all counts, he could be sentenced to life in prison. But here's where the justice system showed its cracks. Instead of facing a full trial, Reeder took an Alford plea. For those unfamiliar, an Alford plea allows a defendant to avoid admitting guilt while still accepting the legal consequences of a conviction. He never had to say the words, "I did it," and because of that, his sentence was significantly lower than it should have been. Instead of life in prison, James Reeder was sentenced to just 37.5 years. He could be eligible for parole. For many, it wasn't enough. In the weeks that followed, the community came together to grieve. Hundreds of people gathered for a candlelight vigil, holding pictures of Koralynn, their faces lit by flickering flames. She was more than just a victim in a case file. She was a little girl who had loved to play. A little girl who had once giggled as she climbed onto furniture. A little girl who had deserved so much more. The question remains, could this have been prevented? Could anyone have saved her? And what does it say about the justice system that a man capable of such cruelty could one day walk free? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The sentencing of James Reeder did little to comfort those who had followed this case from the beginning. A 37.5-year sentence felt inadequate for a crime so horrific. There would be no trial, no chance for a jury to weigh in, no opportunity for the full weight of the law to be imposed. Instead, Reeder had taken an Alford plea, a legal loophole that allowed him to accept his sentence without admitting guilt. To the legal system, it was a conviction. To the public, it was an insult. Because how could a man responsible for the prolonged suffering of a child be allowed even the slightest chance of freedom? For Koralyn's family, the courtroom had been a place of unimaginable pain. As the details of the case were read aloud, the silence in the gallery was almost unbearable. People listened in horror as the prosecutor described the extent of the abuse. They heard how Koralynn had suffered, how she had been isolated, how she had been denied any chance at the life she deserved. And at the center of it all, James Reeder sat, expressionless, as if the words being spoken had nothing to do with him. Even when the judge handed down his sentence, he showed no emotion, no remorse, no regret. And that, more than anything, was what truly haunted those in the courtroom that day. This wasn't just a man who had committed an unspeakable crime. This was a man who felt nothing. While James Reeder was the one who carried out these heinous acts, the focus also turned to Becky Heupel, Koralyn's mother. From the moment the case broke, people were divided. Some believed she had been another victim, manipulated and controlled by a man who knew exactly how to exploit her vulnerabilities. Others saw it differently. To them, she had failed in her most fundamental duty as a mother, to protect her child. But how much responsibility did she truly bear? Prosecutors ultimately charged her with second-degree criminal mistreatment, arguing that her inaction played a role in her daughter's death. The law was clear. She had left Koralynn in the care of a man with a history of violence. She had ignored warnings from friends and family. She had seen the bruises. She had heard the excuses. And yet, she had done nothing. Was it denial? Fear? Or was it something deeper, an inability to fully grasp the reality of what was happening in her own home? Experts weighed in on Becky's mental state, noting that she functioned at a significantly lower cognitive level than most adults. Some argued that this made her more susceptible to manipulation. Others countered that, regardless of her cognitive limitations, a mother should have an instinct to protect. And in this case, that instinct had failed. Her sentence? 1 year and 1 day in prison. For some, it was a fair punishment, acknowledging her vulnerabilities. For others, it was nowhere near enough. Because at the end of the day, Koralynn was gone. And no amount of time served could change that. Koralynn Fister's case raised serious questions about the systems in place that are meant to protect children from harm. How had someone like James Reeder managed to slip through the cracks? His history was not hidden. There were multiple reports from past partners detailing his controlling, violent behavior. Yet, no red flags had prevented him from gaining access to Koralynn. Even after the first signs of physical injuries, no formal investigation had been launched. No welfare check. No intervention. And that wasn't just a failure of one person. It was a failure of the system. Cases like this highlight a terrifying truth. Abusers don't always appear as monsters. They don't introduce themselves as violent. They don't wear signs that say, "I am dangerous." Instead, they blend in. They are charming, helpful, supportive. They do small things to earn trust, cooking meals, offering to help with childcare, showing interest in a struggling parent's life. And once they gain control, they slowly isolate their victims. They make them doubt themselves. They make them feel like they can't survive without them. And then they take everything. For James Reeder, Koralynn wasn't just a child. She was a target. And by the time anyone realized the danger, it was already too late. In the months following Koralynn's death, the community of Centralia struggled to make sense of what had happened. A candlelight vigil was held in her memory, where hundreds gathered to mourn the little girl they never had the chance to truly know. People left flowers, stuffed animals, handwritten notes. Some wrote messages like, "You were loved, even if you never knew it. We will never forget you." The tragedy resonated far beyond Centralia. Child advocacy groups used Koralynn's case as an example of why early intervention is so important. Because too many children fall through the cracks. Too many warning signs go ignored. And too many predators walk free for far too long. This case is one of the most heartbreaking we've ever covered. Because while justice was served in the legal sense, the question remains. Was it enough? Did Becky deserve a harsher punishment for failing to protect her daughter? Should the justice system have done more to prevent James Reeder from ever being in a position of power over a child? And most importantly, how can we, as a society, make sure this never happens again? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. Koralyn's tragic death raised uncomfortable questions about how the justice system handles child protection and repeat offenders. James Reeder was not a first-time criminal. He had a documented history of violence. He had past relationships where women described controlling behavior, accusations of infidelity, and even physical abuse. One woman recounted how he had taken her phone, demanded to know who she was talking to, and over time, isolated her from friends and family. Another woman described how he had grown more aggressive during her pregnancy, going as far as to physically assault her after she had just given birth. These were not secret behaviors. They were patterns. And yet, despite the warning signs, despite the stories from his past, nothing stopped him from gaining access to another vulnerable woman and, most tragically, her 2-year-old daughter. The system had failed to stop him. And by the time it caught up with him, it was already too late. Why weren't the red flags enough? This is a question that haunts many cases of child abuse and domestic violence. Why aren't prior reports of violence enough to prevent an abuser from repeating their actions? The reality is, the legal system is often reactive, not proactive. Unless there is a direct and ongoing threat that can be proven in court, many abusers walk free, even with multiple accusations against them. In some cases, past victims fear coming forward. They worry they won't be believed. They worry about retaliation. And even when they do report abuse, sometimes the legal consequences aren't enough to deter future crimes. James Reeder was never convicted for the abuse reported by his ex-partners. No paper trail existed that would have alerted authorities when he entered Becky Hoyple's life. So, when he moved in, when he took on the role of a caring boyfriend and stepfather, there was no record to warn Becky, or anyone else, that this man was capable of unimaginable cruelty. By the time he showed his true nature, Koralynn was already in danger. And once again, the system had failed to protect a child before tragedy struck. Understanding how predators like James Reeder manipulate their way into positions of trust is crucial to preventing future tragedies. Many predators use calculated strategies to gain control over their victims. They identify vulnerable targets. Reeder didn't pursue confident, independent women. He sought out women who were struggling, isolated, or in need of support. They gained trust quickly. Reeder moved in with Becky just weeks after reconnecting online. He positioned himself as a helpful partner, cooking, cleaning, and taking on parenting responsibilities. They isolate their victims. Once in Becky's home, he began controlling who she talked to. He belittled her and discouraged her from seeking help. They escalate control gradually. At first, it was small things, demanding access to Becky's phone, making decisions about the children. Over time, he took complete control over Koralynn's care. By the time the abuse became undeniable, Becky was emotionally trapped. And Koralynn had nowhere to escape. Why didn't Becky fight back? This is the question that divided so many people following the case. How could a mother ignore the signs that her child was in danger? Why didn't she leave? The answer is more complex than it seems. Becky Hoyple had cognitive impairments that made her more susceptible to manipulation. She functioned at an 8th grade level and had spent much of her life relying on others to help her make decisions. For someone like Becky, the ability to recognize manipulation and deception was significantly reduced. And James Reeder knew that. He conditioned her to doubt herself. He gaslight her, making her believe she was overreacting whenever she questioned the bruises on Koralynn's body. He made her feel like she needed him. And for someone with limited independence, That feeling was incredibly powerful. So, was Becky responsible for her daughter's death? Legally, yes. She was charged with second-degree criminal mistreatment. But morally, ethically, was she another victim of readers' manipulation? That's the question that still lingers. Let us know what you think in the comments. Koralynn's case sparked discussions about how the legal system can better protect children from predators. One of the most important takeaways was the need for early intervention. Mandatory background checks for live-in partners of parents receiving welfare or social services assistance. Easier ways for community members to report suspected abuse without fear of retaliation. Harsher penalties for repeat domestic abusers, even when their past victims do not press charges. While changes in law take time, cases like Koralynn's push conversations forward. Because no child should suffer in silence. Beyond the legal discussions and courtroom outcomes, there was one undeniable truth. A 2-year-old girl had lost her life. She never got to experience her first day of school. She never got to learn how to ride a bike. She never got to grow up. For those who knew her, the loss was unbearable. Her sister, who had once shared a home with her, would grow up without the sibling she should have had by her side. Her grandmother, who had noticed the warning signs but wasn't able to intervene in time, would live with that guilt forever. And her community, who came together in the wake of her death, would never forget the little girl with bright eyes and a future that was stolen from her. Even after the trial ended, even after the sentences were handed down, the story of Koralynn Fister was far from over. Because when a tragedy of this magnitude unfolds, it doesn't simply fade away. It leaves behind questions, scars, and lives forever changed. What happened to the people involved? Where is James Reader now? And how does a family move forward when the unthinkable has happened? Let's take a look at life after the case. James Reader was sentenced to 37.5 years in prison. It was a sentence meant to ensure he could never harm another child again. But the reality of the prison system is more complex than that. For most convicted offenders, a sentence is not always final. There are opportunities for appeals, parole hearings, and sentence reductions. And while Reader's sentence was lengthy, it wasn't life without parole. Which means there's a possibility, no matter how small, that one day he could walk free. While behind bars, Reader will be classified as a high-risk offender. That means he will be closely monitored, with little chance of early release. However, there is one troubling fact. Despite the nature of his crimes, he was not required to register as a sex offender. That means if he were ever released, there would be no public record of his past. For many, this is one of the biggest failures of the justice system in this case. How can a man convicted of such horrifying crimes avoid the label that would warn the world of who he is? It's a question that still sparks outrage today. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that many repeat offenders don't stop after just one victim. And that is why people continue to fight to keep James Reader exactly where he belongs. Behind bars. Did Becky rebuild her life? After serving 1 year and 1 day in prison, Becky Heupel was released. Her sentence was controversial from the start. Some believed she deserved more time, arguing that a mother should be held accountable for failing to protect her child. Others saw her as another victim, manipulated and controlled by a man who knew exactly how to take advantage of her vulnerabilities. But when she walked free, one thing was clear. She would never escape the consequences of what had happened. Life after a case like this is never simple. Even though she had completed her legal sentence, she would always be known as the mother who failed to save her child. She lost custody of her older daughter. She was shunned by much of her community. And, perhaps worst of all, she had to live every day knowing that she had ignored the warning signs. For some, that punishment is worse than any prison sentence. While much of the focus in this case was on Becky and James, there was another person who suffered greatly. David Fister, Koralynn's biological father. David was not a perfect man. At times, he had been absent. At times, he had struggled with his role as a father. But when he lost his daughter, he lost his chance to make things right. David had no idea that his little girl was being hurt. He had no idea that, when he saw her for the last time, it would truly be the last. For him, the guilt was suffocating. Because while he hadn't been the one to harm Koralynn, he hadn't been there to save her either. And that is something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. When a child is lost in such a violent way, the impact ripples through an entire community. People ask, could I have done something? Should I have spoken up sooner? Did I miss a sign that could have saved her? And for family members, those questions never stop. How do you move forward when someone you love has been taken so cruelly? There is no easy answer. Some find solace in advocacy, working to change the laws that failed their loved ones. Some seek therapy and support groups, hoping to process their grief. And some never fully heal, forever trapped in the moment they received the news that changed their lives forever. Koralynn's story shook the small town of Centralia, Washington. This wasn't the kind of place where things like this were supposed to happen. This was a town where people knew their neighbors, where families gathered in parks, where children were supposed to be safe. But after Koralynn's death, people began looking at the world differently. People became more aware of the signs of abuse. Neighbors became more willing to speak up when something didn't seem right. And while nothing could bring Koralynn back, her story made people more vigilant. Because tragedies like this don't just disappear. They leave a mark. And sometimes, that mark changes people forever. As we bring this story to a close, there are some key lessons we must take away. Trust your instincts. If something doesn't feel right, speak up. Predators often seem like good people at first. They know how to manipulate. Warning signs should never be ignored. Unexplained injuries, changes in behavior, these are cries for help. The justice system isn't perfect. Cases like this remind us that change is still needed. We all have a role to play. Whether it's reporting abuse, supporting survivors, or demanding stronger laws, we can all help prevent tragedies like this. Now, we turn to you. What do you think? Did Becky deserve a longer sentence? Should James Reeder ever be eligible for release? And what can society do to better protect vulnerable children from predators? Let us know in the comments. Because this isn't just a story. It's a conversation. And every voice matters. If you believe in keeping stories like this alive, in making sure victims like Koralynn are never forgotten, then subscribe to True Crime Watch HD. Because awareness leads to action. And action leads to change. Koralynn Fister should have had a lifetime ahead of her. She should have been able to grow up, to play, to laugh, to live. Instead, her life was stolen. But her memory doesn't have to be. We remember her. We fight for her. And we make sure her story is never forgotten. Thank you for watching. Until next time, take care.